so you guys can hear me. And you notice behind me it says, would we have believed them? How many of you have thought about messages before? A message that someone brings. How about the messenger who brings the message? You guys ever thought about that as well? Well, this morning I want us to look at the whole concept of as we live today versus what it was like in the first century. How many of you guys lived in the 20th century before? If you're alive, you've lived in the 20th century. We're now in the 21st century, okay? But I want you to think about something for just a moment. Would you believe these lists of people I'm going to give you for just a moment? Would you believe the message if you were living in the first century? Would you have believed the message of John the Baptist? Or would you believe the message of Peter? Do you think you would believe the message of Paul? Now, I want you to think about those three individuals. Obviously, there were many more of them throughout the New Testament and Old Testament. But I want us to think about messengers for a little bit here this morning. I want us to think about where do we place the bulk of our importance. I'll be honest with you, if I was standing before someone and their hair was bright pink, I'd have a hard time staying focused. I'd probably miss most of the message that person might give that morning. But I want us to think about our life, in our communities that we live in, and in our churches that we're part of. If you probably answered the question, would you listen to John the Baptist? Would you listen to Peter? Would you listen to Paul? You probably answered that in something like this. Well, of course I would. I believe him today. Right? You probably would have answered it that way. But I want us to think about something. Today's day and age that we live in, how many of you guys know that there are multitudes of various versions of the Bible? Did you guys know that? Okay. How many of you guys know that when John the Baptist and Peter and Paul spoke, they weren't reading from a King James Version Bible? Did you guys know that? Okay. So with this in mind, I want you to think about the Bible today. We have various versions. Some of those versions, they're not very good. Some of those versions are kind of in the middle. And some of those versions are better than the ones in the middle and the ones all the way to the right that aren't very good. And I want us to think about this for just a moment. Why do we have various Bibles? Why do we have a New International Version versus English for today's version versus the King James Version versus a New King James Version? We have various translations because of people's appetite for how things are written. How many of you like to read something that can be offensive? Right? We live in a bunch of a culture today that, boy, if you're offensive, there's something wrong with you. Okay? If you read something culture deems to be offensive, then they want you to be quiet. Did you guys know Greg Lowry he took down a silhouette of himself in California because the image appeared to be of a Bible and the people were offended by the Bible that appeared to be the Bible. They even say Bible on the silhouette and they took it down. Now, I want us to understand that most of the time we have various versions of the Bible because people want to water down what the Word says. Okay? A lot of times, have you ever heard people say this? Boy, the truth hurts. Right? None of us like that. Right? We don't like the truth. Well, sometimes if we were living in the first century, I promise you this, that John the Baptist, Peter, and Paul did not care if they stepped on your toes or if they stepped on my toes. They wouldn't have cared. Okay? So I want you to think about this. Would you listen to John the Baptist? Would you listen to Peter? And would you listen to Paul? And let's take a look at those three individuals and ask yourself that question again. All right, let's take a look at John the Baptist. John the Baptist was a hermit. Okay? John the Baptist was one who kind of was off by himself. He was one that kind of preached all by himself. And in Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, let's turn there for just a moment. Let's see what kind of preaching that John the Baptist did. Again, Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Let's listen to what he had to say, where he was when he went, when he's preached to the people. Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 says this: "In those days came John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness of Judea, and saying, Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." He preached where, the Bible tells us? In the wilderness. That means he wasn't in town. That means he was out in the country, if you will. And that's where he was. He preached the message that God gave him. In fact, if you wanted to hear John the Baptist, you in a way were forced to walk out there and to go see him. So if you really wanted to hear him, you had to put forth a lot of effort for that to happen. So he was out there, and people would have to come to hear him. Stay right there in Matthew chapter 3. Let's go to verse 4 for just a moment. And it says this: "And the same John had his raiment of camel's hair, and a leather girdle about his loins, and his meat was locusts and wild honey." Now, he dressed a little bit funny, wouldn't you agree? Or at least it appears to us that way. He had camel's hair. Every time I read that passage, I just want to start scratching. You know? I just want to start scratching. Man, that had to itch. That had to be hot. But this is what it is that he wore for clothing. And I want you to notice what he ate. How many of you are going to go eat somewhere after church today? Are you going to go get locusts and wild honey? Well, why not? It's right there in the Bible. It's biblical. It didn't kill him. What's the problem? Because it's not something we do any longer, is it? It's not something that we think about. So he dressed himself in camel's hair. He had a leather girdle about himself. And he ate locusts and honey. I can handle the honey, but the locust part, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I've never tried it before, so I don't know if it's good or bad. Okay? I just know that I have a hard time swallowing it. All right? So now we have a messenger who we have to go see in the wilderness. A messenger who has camel's hair around him as his clothing. A messenger who has a leather girdle about him as well. And a messenger who we know eats locusts and wild honey. I bet people are just lining up to get out of church to go see him one day. Okay? So this is what they're trying to do. Now let's look at something else. Verses 5 through 7. Listen to what he had to say. "Then went out him unto Jerusalem, all of Judea, and all the region round about Jordan, and were baptized of him in the Jordan, confessing their sins." Sounds pretty good, right? That sounds like he's making people's lives are being changed and people are coming to know Jesus Christ. Verse 7 says, "But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Wow, what a message. I want you to imagine you are a religious leader of Jerusalem. And you had decided, I've got to go see this guy who's wearing camel's hair, leather girdle, eats locusts and honey, and he's calling me nothing but a brood of vipers. That's what I want to go see this guy, right? This is what I'm going to go do. Now, I want you to imagine for a moment, if I stood up here and called every one of you a brood of vipers, how would you feel right now? I don't know. I'd be like, wait a minute, what is he exactly? First of all, define what that means, right? But you see, this is what he did. He preached the message, and he said, this is who you are. And guess what happened, guys? They kept coming. These people kept coming over. So my question is, when we go and listen to someone, do we listen to the message, or do we look at what they're wearing? Or do we see what they're wearing and not pay attention to the message, and vice versa? We have all this going on. But John the Baptist was a hermit. He was very harsh in his words, wasn't he? Said he called them nothing but a bunch of brood of vipers. He is one that the odds are we probably would not have taken very serious if we went out to see him. Okay? I met a minister years ago, and this person's hair was white and purple. And I don't mean gray, because they colored it white, and the hair was purple. I'm not going to lie to you. There's absolutely no focus on anything they said except for the purple hair. Okay? I'm not making that up. But the reality is that many of us would have probably said, I don't want to walk out that far to see somebody who's going to say those things about me. I don't want to go out there and hear the truth. I don't want to go out there because he doesn't dress like I do. Doesn't talk like I do. I don't want to go out there and do that. And guess what? Many people didn't. But John the Baptist was one who changed many, many people's lives. Have you ever noticed that in culture today, we have these unwritten dress codes. Did you guys know that? They're not really written down, but boy, we assume that they're there. How many of you guys like baseball? Okay? I want you to know something. If a rule is not written down, it's not actually a rule. Okay? There are unwritten rules in baseball. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but if you play baseball, you are not to run across the pitcher's mound after you get out from first base going back to your dugout. It's an unwritten rule. And the reality, guys, is, you know what? It is not a rule. Okay? But boy, does it make the opposing pitcher mad. I've seen it before. And it's interesting, as a culture today, one of the things that we have is we have these unwritten rules. We have unwritten rules in church. And what we have in unwritten rules in church is, well, you don't dress the part. And especially many, many years ago, boy, if you didn't dress the part, people didn't take you serious. If the preacher didn't dress the part, they didn't take him very serious. And the person singing the song, they didn't take him very serious, right? Because we have an unwritten rule that we think we know how a preacher and how a church person should dress. Okay? And it's called an unwritten rule, which makes it what? Not a rule at all. Okay? It's just our opinion. So when we look at John the Baptist, I don't know if I'm going to go see that guy. He can't be very smart if he's wearing camel's hair, leather girl, eats honey and locusts. Right? We can't. I don't want to do that because man, he'll make me uncomfortable. And I want to encourage all of us. You know what? The odds are, sometimes people come to us with messages. Sometimes they come and they don't fit the part of the message. Okay? They're coming and we really don't pay any attention. Who was the second king of Israel? Does anybody know? His name was David. His name was David, and David was a scrawny kid who God was willing to use, and his dad and his brothers said he wasn't big enough or strong enough. He was the smallest of all. And that he could not be used because he was too little. He wanted David's father, Jesse, wanted his older brothers who were stronger, who looked the part, to become just that, the next king of Israel. And the fact is that David was the one God chose, wasn't he? In fact, what happened was, as David was out in the field, David said, I don't see anybody. I don't see anybody here. Let's go back for a second to 1 Samuel chapter 16. Let's see this for just a moment. Let's see some things here about we have a tendency to do if we're not careful. And again, it's 1 Samuel chapter 16. I want you to see something here of what takes place. And it's interesting because the Bible tells us that David was a guy who the Bible says is a man after God's own heart. So 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 7 says this. Samuel was mourning the loss of Saul, and he went out, and Saul, he goes out, and in verse 7, it says this, but the Lord said to Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. You see, they wanted to pick somebody who looked the part to play the part. You see, the thing is God will use you just like you are. God will change you when he wants to change you. God will use you no matter how big, how small, how young, how old you might be, despite what anybody else has to say about it. God will use you. And this is what they were trying to shut David down, the second king of Israel. Brother Donnie there said he didn't fit the part. He can't be the guy that we need. His own brothers put him down. He can't be that person we need. And who did God use? The one everybody said, what? That's not the guy. That's not the guy that needs to be in that position. But God used him greatly. Well, how about Peter? I think we've talked about Peter a few times. But let's take a look at Peter. Peter was more of a hillbilly. You guys, can anybody relate to a hillbilly? You guys, it's okay if you can. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Okay? Peter had this idea of more about being a hillbilly. See, what people think about when they use that terminology is they think someone who is not well educated, right? Who's not capable of doing things. Well, one of the things that I want us to see about Peter is Peter wasn't a well-educated guy. Okay? So let's go to Acts, if you would, Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Let's see what it has to say here about Peter. So Peter in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, it tells us this. They had been spending time with Jesus in Acts chapter 4. verse 13, they had been spending time with him. They had been preaching. They knew that they had been preaching the word of God. They knew they had been with Jesus at some point in their life. Because listen to these words. It says, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. He wasn't very smart according to who? The Pharisees. He wasn't well educated. Well, a lot of people during Peter's time was not well educated. But that didn't stop Peter from being used by God. You know how many times I've heard people say, I'm not smart enough to do that. I'm not capable of being used by God the way you think I can be used by God. I want you to know something this morning. If you are willing, God will use you. It doesn't matter if you've got a seminary degree, a college degree, or even a high school degree. God will still use you if you are willing to be used. He will still use you. And here is Peter. They're judging Peter based upon the fact of his lack of education, at least as they saw it. Now, how about this one? Peter had his faults. Remember, Peter had a few problems going on. If you would, please take your Bibles. Let's see one of the problems Peter created. And go with me, if you would, please, to Galatians chapter 2. Let's see what happens here with Peter. Let's see what he did to a church in Galatia. And let's see this again. It's Galatians chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Let's see what it has to say here to us. Again, starting in verse 11 of Galatians chapter 2. It says this, But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. This is Paul speaking. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles, but when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. I want you to know what happened right there in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11, 12, and 13. You ready? 2 words. Church split. Okay? Church split. Now, this is a man who had problems, right? We've learned this before with Peter. He had some issues. He loved the Lord, but he was very, very human like everybody else. And so as we think about Peter, if we think about the things that he did, a man, if we were living in the first century, a man who wasn't very educated, a man who just split a church, and now he wants me to listen to him? See, that's a legitimate question we have to ask ourselves, is are we willing to listen to someone who did such a thing? Because I want you to know something. This man, Peter, we probably would have looked at and said, I'm not listening to him. Why? Because, he wasn't taught by the rabbis. And he wasn't taught by those people who were supposed to know the law. He wasn't taught by any of these individuals. He was taught by Jesus, who we don't really agree with anyway, because he's from Nazareth, and nothing good comes from Nazareth. So would we truly listen to Peter? Probably not. You see, he split a church too. Why would we want to listen to him? He denied the Lord and Savior. Think about that for a moment. He denied Jesus Christ 3 times. Why would I listen to a guy who would deny Jesus Christ 3 times? You see, the fact is that Peter had flaws. Peter had flaws, and something else I want us to remember. Peter didn't have a seminary degree, a doctorate degree, or any other of those degrees. But boy, did he preach. Oh, he was flawed. Every one of us are flawed. But he loved the Lord. He could preach. He led people to the Lord. He had led a great revival of the church starting out in the book of Acts. What if the church would have said, he's done too many wrong things for us to let him do these anymore? You see, Peter repented, it tells us, when he denied the Lord. Peter made a few mistakes along the way. But I want us to think about today for just a moment. There's a lot of headlines going on about Christians who have really messed up. And I'm not saying that a person that there are not consequences for actions, but what I am saying is is the church today, would we be willing to do as the early church did for Peter? Would we be willing to say, yes, you messed up, we forgive you, now be used by God? That's what Peter did. Peter messed up, but he was used by God. In Matthew chapter 18, let's go there for just a moment, verses 21 through 22. Now, one of the things here that we have is Peter, again, was never afraid to speak his mind. He was never afraid to do this. And he says this in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22. It says this, "Then came Peter to him," referring to Jesus, "and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times? Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee unto 7 times, but unto 70 times 7. That I want you to know something. That means every single time your brother does you wrong, you are to forgive them. Don't have a notebook. God says, okay, that's their 448th time. They get one more chance. Okay? No, it means every single time. All right? And Peter had to be forgiven a lot. You and I have had to be forgiven in our lives. And we serve God who says, I forgive you, and I'm willing to forgive you, and I'm willing to use you. Do not say I can't be used by God because I have done things that are just plain wrong. Because I want you to know something. Sin is wrong no matter what it is. So every single one of us has done something wrong in the eyes of God. And if we go to God and say, God, forgive me of my sins, you know what he does? He forgives you and wipes the slate clean and says, now I'm ready to use you. Let's go. Don't be afraid to be used by God. Don't use the excuse that I cannot be forgiven, because God will forgive you if you ask him. He will forgive you if he asks you, if you ask him. So think about that for just a moment. Let us make sure we never, ever, ever think we can't be forgiven. Guys, I understand there's consequences for things that take place. Don't misunderstand me there at all. But guys, we can never hold it against someone who God forgives. If God has forgiven them, guess what we're supposed to do? Forgive. We need to remember that. God wants to use you. He wants to use me no matter what. So he's used a few good people here so far this morning. He's used John the Baptist. He's used Peter. And the next person he's used, if you've read the Old Testament, you've read his writings. As Saul, who we know as Paul, wrote over half of the New Testament. So let's look at his life. He was a nerd, if you were to break it down according to all the things that we have going on. He was a person who was, he's very book smart. You ever meet people that are book smart and you go, really? Right? I can remember being in college, people saying they have book smarts but no common sense. Right? Okay? I want you to understand something. There's nothing wrong with book smarts. So if you have book smarts, you keep doing it. Okay? It's perfectly fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But Paul was a person who thought he knew it all based upon what he had read. Based on all the law. Based on all these things. And boy, he was going to make sure that everybody else followed it the same way. But what type of person was Paul? What type of person was he? First and foremost, he was a blasphemer. Okay? He was a blasphemer, and he persecuted the church. Would you want to go listen to him? In fact, when he first became a Christian, what happened? Does anybody remember this morning? The people were scared to listen to him, and rightly so. They were scared to listen to him. They were scared because they weren't sure exactly what it was that he was going to be about. Turn with me, please, and turn with me. Go back to Titus for just a moment. I want you to see some things here that we have about Jesus as he wrote this to us here this morning. Titus chapter 1. I want you to see verse 13. Listen to what it says. This witness is true, wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in their faith. He was an affluent speaker. He was not afraid to speak what God had shared with him, as you see there in verse 13. He was a man that he was a good speaker. He constantly persecuted the church. He was good at what he did. Have you ever met people that are really good at what they do? You ever meet people like that? Okay, hopefully you're all good at what you do. But Paul was a guy, he was really, really good at what he did. He understood the law as far as he interpreted it. He interpreted the law based upon his experiences, not on who God is. So he very much thought he was doing the right things out there. Go with me and stay here in the New Testament. Go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 for just a moment. Let us see something else about Paul that maybe you never really thought about before. Because maybe you're sitting here and you're saying, well, God can't use me. Physically, I'm not capable of being used by God. Listen to what it says about Paul here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10. Listen to what it says. For his letters say they are weighty and powerful, but his bodily appearance is weak, and his speech contemptible. Boy, he had it both ways. They didn't like the words that he used, and they didn't like the way he looked. Do you think he cared? No. All he cared about, and hopefully all we all care about, is how God can use us. Hopefully that's what we are interested in here. People looked at him, boy, he didn't look very good. Come on, I want you to think about for just a moment. They say that many of the people that you hear on the radio, when the radio hosts that are speaking, they say some of those people that are speaking can barely walk because they're so big. But they have a good what? Voice. And then when you see them, you say, wow, that surprises me, catches me off guard that they look this way or that way. Have you ever done that before? You know, when you're talking to somebody on the phone you've never met before, and maybe you're going to go meet them, and you try to figure out, put in your head, what do they look like based upon the sound of their voice? When we first moved to Wyoming, we spoke with someone who became a really good friend. And I cannot remember the exact words Jennifer used about this person, how she thought he would look. She was completely wrong. Okay? But it was funny because I said, he doesn't look like that at all. He doesn't look like I can't remember what she said now. He doesn't look like that at all. I want you to think about this. What if you didn't know what a speaker looked like before you got there? There's a speaker out there. I cannot remember his name. He's a motivational speaker primarily, but he has no arms and no feet. And he actually has to sit on top of a desk, similar to the altar right here, for people to see him. One of the best speakers I've ever heard in my life. Okay? We need to make sure that we do not delegitimize a message based upon how someone looks. Okay? Or what their words might be. You ever stumble over your words? I have. We all have. But let us never delegitimize what the person is saying. Because they don't look the part. Sometimes their words kind of stumble when they come out. But let us make sure what we're doing is because God is the one who we are trying to get the message from. The question is, if you were living in the first century, would you have listened to a blasphemer? Would you have listened to a guy that split a church? Would you listen to a guy that he had camel's hair and ate locusts? Would we have listened to him in the first century? There's a good possibility that we wouldn't have. But it's hard to really answer that question, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But I want us to think about this. How can God transform your life if you don't think you're perfect? Because that's what most people think. They think, I have to be perfect in order to be used by God. Right? That's what people think. People outside the church, they look at the church and they say, those people think they're perfect. Guys, we don't have to be perfect to serve God. I want us to look at a few characters, and I'm not going to have you flip back and forth in the scriptures. I'm going to name some names. I want to see if you know who it is. Okay? There's some people in the New Testament very specifically. There was a man who was living amongst the tombs. And one day Jesus came across the lake. And this guy came out. The Bible tells us he was unclothed. He was crazy. He was just a mean person. And the Bible tells us that when Jesus got close to him, they spoke and they said, our name is Legion, for we are many. And if you remember what happened in that story, if you don't, I'm going to tell you what happened. Legion requested that Jesus was going to cast him out of this man. A man who was crazy as far as everybody around him was concerned. A man who there's no way they're going to listen to. And he cast him out into the herd of swine. And the Bible tells us once that happened that he was in his right mind, clothed and everything. You don't think that guy could have a great message if people would be willing to listen, do you? What a message. Listen, no matter where you are at in your life, God can use you. Yeah, you might need some polishing. We all need some polishing every once in a while, okay? But let God do the polishing. Don't worry about what the world thinks you should be polishing. Worry about what God wants to use you as. There's another story. There was a lady. She was around a well. And Jesus saw her. And she was there. And the story, the Bible tells us that Jesus looks at her and says, I'm thirsty. Can you give me something to drink? A woman who, she looked at Jesus and said, but you don't have anything to pick up that water. And says, I don't need it. But I can give you living water. A woman who Jesus looked at and said, you know what? You're right, you don't have a husband right now. You've had all these other husbands, and the one man you're living with now, he is not your husband. And this woman, the Bible tells us, ran off into the town. Does anybody remember what happened? The whole town got saved. That's what happened. They ran out, she went into town, and she said, you got to come see this man who knows everything about me. And he changed their life. You wouldn't think for a moment that that's somebody God could use, would you? But he used her. You wouldn't think for a moment that God could use somebody like Legion, but he did. I promise you, he did. Or how about this person? His sisters were crying. Their names were Mary and Martha. And that their brother had died. And Jesus waited as far as they were concerned to come and to help them. And Jesus got to town and Jesus spoke the words. He said, Lazarus, come out. And the Bible tells us that Lazarus came out. Even after the sisters said, he's been in there for days, he's stinky by now. And what happened? He came out. He was perfectly fine. And I guarantee you, the word spread that this man that God raised was alive. Think about that for a moment. Jesus, who came from the wrong side of the tracks as far as people were concerned. Jesus, who came from a carpenter's family. Jesus, who didn't have the education either as far as they were concerned, was still used by God in ways that no one else ever will be in history because he was the Savior of the world. What about you? Don't be afraid to be used by God. It doesn't make any difference to God if you have a doctorate degree or a high school degree. What he cares about is, are you willing to be used by him? That's what he cares about. That's what he wants from all of us. He wants us to be used by him. I want us to think about that for a moment. Many years ago, I was told that I was too young to do a certain position that I was thinking about doing. You guys ever been told that? They're too young. They're too old. Because one of the things we got to make sure we understand is as a church and as Christians, that God determines who's too old and who's too young. We don't get to. God can use any of us. There's a remarkable success rate when we let God use us. Did you know that? He uses us in ways in which we never thought he could. Maybe you're here this morning, you might say, you know what? I just work out. Go to work every day. I stand at the clock. I come in, stand at the clock, and I go home. Or maybe I'm just a school teacher. I really don't do anything else. I go to school. I come home. Go to school. I go home. I grade papers, so forth. Or maybe you might say, I just work at Walmart. Or maybe I just work down the street at McDonald's. God can't use me. Yes, he can. God doesn't care where you're working. God doesn't care what your education degree is. God doesn't care if you're wearing a suit and tie or a pair of shorts. What God cares about is, are you willing to be used by Him? And more lives have been changed throughout history by people who simply say, I want to, no matter what. The missionary that we had at children's camp this past year, he told the kids, he said, I thought I was too old to be used by God. Now, he was older than me, so it means he was old. And he went to Panama. And he said, I don't have an education degree to be used on the mission field. And it's true. Within the Southern Baptist Convention, if you don't have a seminary degree, you cannot be appointed as a missionary, full-time missionary. You can go, but you're called a missionary apprentice. He didn't have any of those things. So his age was against him as far as he was concerned. And his education was against him as far as he was concerned. And a friend of his called him and said, hey, we need help. I said, okay, I'll go. And guys, do you know what? He's one of the 5,000 plus missionaries we support with our cooperative program and with our Latin Christmas offering to this day. He could have said, nope, not smart enough. Nope, too old. Guys, you and I can be our own worst enemy. We can be our own worst enemy. Don't be afraid to be used by God. Look at these individuals. Come on, think about this for a moment. Peter, John the Baptist, Saul, King Paul, King David, the shortest runt of the group as far as his brothers were concerned, Solomon. Guys that were willing to be used by God. Women, Deborah was used by God. Lydia was used by God. Don't be afraid. Say, God, use me wherever and however you want to use me. Here's the key, guys. We need to make sure we get out of the way of God and let God use people the way God's wanting them to be used. That's what He wants. Be used by God this morning. Be used by Him. So I'm going to close with one more question. Or one more statement, I guess. I asked you, would you be willing to listen to a guy with camel's hair and a girdle, with a leather girdle, and eating locusts and honey? Would you be willing to listen to a guy who was a church splitter, who was a denier of Jesus Christ? Would you be willing to listen to a guy who blasphemed God, who persecuted Christians? And again, if you were living in the first century, and it's a legitimate answer to say, I don't know, I didn't live there in that time. But here's where the kicker comes in. Are you willing to listen to them today? If we're not willing to listen to what Peter wrote today, we wouldn't listen to him in the first century. If we're not willing to listen to what Paul had to say today, we wouldn't listen to him in the first century. If we don't listen to what John the Baptist wrote today, we wouldn't listen to him in the first century. But I guarantee you this, if we were willing to listen to all three of them this morning and today, we would have listened to them in the first century. Where are you at? Are you willing to listen to what God might have to say to you? Are you willing to be used by God no matter what the circumstances might be in your life? God will take care of all that. He's a God of order, a God of peace. He knows your circumstances, and He'll use you anyway. Will you let Him use you? Will you listen to the messengers of the Scriptures? Guys that were flawed, but God still said, I'm going to give them a message to share with the world. And that's what He did. Will you listen to His word this morning? Brother Donnie, would you come? Would you listen to what it is He wants you to do? God just wants our obedience. And once we are willing to be obedient to Him, He'll take care of the rest.